All right. Thank you all very much for coming out and joining us this afternoon. I know that the weather is not great, so I really appreciate you braving it for us today. My name is Caitlin, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Matheson History Museum. Before we get started, I just want to thank our sponsors, Visit Gainesville, Alachua County, the State of Florida Division of Cultural Affairs, and the City of Gainesville. Our grants from these organizations help to make all of the exhibits and programs that we do possible. But in addition to our grant sponsors, we also rely on our members and donors. So if you like what we're doing here, I encourage you to become a member of the Matheson. We have our wonderful visitor services associate here, Willett, in the back, ready to engage you for a membership to renew or make a donation. We really appreciate all of the support of everybody in our community. And again, thank you all for coming. So we are here to hear from Mallory and John O'Connor about their latest collaborative project, their COVID lockdown project. And we are really delighted to, be hearing from them today as they finally have a finished product in their hands and are ready to share it with us all. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Mallory and John.
Thank you very much, Caitlin, and thank all of you for coming out on this rather dreary afternoon. We're almost drowned on the way over here, I think. It was going through very deep puddles and so on. I was thinking I might be back in California. But this has been a really kind of amazing project, and I'm going to show you some of the images from our um, collaboration because we started it as a collaborative project. And as Caitlin mentioned, it was our COVID lockdown project because we'd been wanting to do this for a long time in terms of collaborating on a cookbook project. But, uh, you know, we're busy. So when are we going to do that? Uh, and then enter COVID. Well, not being able to go out very much or to entertain or to interact a lot, we said, okay, now we've got some time. We'll just buckle down and do this project that we've been wanting to do. So, what is our book about and why has it been called a reinvention of the traditional cookbook? One of the reviews mentioned that or used that actually as their headline. John and Mallory O'Connor have reinvented the traditional cookbook. Okay, how is it different and what is it about? Well, first of all, it is a cookbook, but it's also a memoir. And because John did 106 beautiful original paintings to illustrate the recipes instead of taking photos, it's an art book. And it's also, um, as I said, a cookbook and an art book and a memoir and a love story because we just celebrated our 60th wedding anniversary. So we have been together since we were little kittens. And and it's been a great run. And this cookbook is one of the sort of crowning achievements of our life together. We met at the University of California in Davis in 1962, and then we were married in January 1963, so that didn't take too long. From the beginning, we both shared a passion for good food and wine, and that has continued and been one of the focuses of our relationship. And people sometimes, look askance when we say, oh, no, no, we can't do that at 7 o'clock. That's when we have dinner. And we've got our priorities. So we know what's important to us. And one of the things has always been to dine well and graciously and enjoy it and not hurry. So that is just has been a constant in our relationship. So this book is both a memoir of our life together as artists and teachers and a collection of the celebrations and occasions that we have shared with friends and family over the years. And it's also a book about the idea of food and our relationship to it. So it's a personal history of our relationship with food, cooking and eating, and a philosophy of food that has sustained us. As I mentioned, it's filled with John's original works, and you can see some of the original pastel paintings over on the easels if you have a chance to take a look afterward. And John's also going to be saying something about how he created these pastel masterpieces toward the end of the talk here. All right, let's try the next one. Okay. This is our wedding back in January of 1963. And it came about in a rather peculiar way because I was a freshman at the University of California at Davis, and John was a graduate student there. And he was the graduate assistant in Wayne Thiebaud's Art 1 drawing class that I took when I was first at Davis. So we met very early on, and I was awed. I mean, a graduate student? Oh my, isn't that something? And the fact that he would actually talk to me? Wow, oh, well, I was kind of an intrepid freshman, I guess. All right, next, please. What do you do when you meet somebody that paints a portrait of his stove? I mean, excuse me? I knew right off that there was something significant about food in this guy that I had met. This is from 1961, and it's what is that, casein or acrylic? What is that, John? Oh, okay, so oil on paper, a painting of John's stove. So you can see where his priorities were even there. Next. That's in 1963, not long after John and I were married. He took me to meet two of his artist friends that he had known for quite a while, and they would have a significant influence on me. William Theo Brown and his partner, Paul Warner, lived in a lovely house in Malibu, just down the coast from where we were. And I was enchanted with their beautiful home and the surroundings. They just had a marvelous eye for detail, and it showed up in everything that they did. We had lunch on the patio overlooking the ocean and dined on a very simple but delicious lunch that Paul had prepared, a cheese omelet, fresh greens from the garden that he had cultivated, and for dessert, an absolutely luxurious strawberry Bavarian cream. On our next visit, I asked Bill what career path he thought I should take. I had started out as an art student, and I ended up getting a BFA in art, but I was drawn to other things, music, art history, and I was trying to figure out my path. Which direction should I go? And so he thought for a minute, and then he said, live the artist's life. Live the artist's life. I wondered what that meant. I didn't want to ask him, what do you mean? So I just kind of puzzled over that for quite some time. And I finally figured out that there were no rules, really. You didn't have to starve in a garret. You didn't have to drink yourself to death. You didn't have to cut off your ear, Uh, you didn't even really have to make art physically. The whole idea of living the artist's life was to live with an eye to your passions, your point of view, the things that you cherished, whether they were people or places or ideas. It meant really having an eye and searching for something that was rare and extraordinary, something that mattered to you, that lasted, something that you found nurtured you. And I think that was the idea was that your life was your art, and you created your life one brush stroke at a time. So you'd better be careful about where you put the brush strokes, because you wanted to end up with a beautiful painting that would describe your life. Another artist friend, the sculptor Jeffrey Naylor, later told me art is what you can always come home to. So I rather like that too. So we have incorporated into our book the idea of living the artist's life and what it meant to us. Next. And speaking of the artist's life, it's amazing how many artists love to eat. The connection between food and art has a long and delicious history. Okay, let's look at this example. When people started making art, that is, really trying to capture something that they were seeing, something that was important to them, something that was in their experience that they wanted to document. We're talking about Paleolithic period here, paintings on cave walls from thousands and thousands of years ago. And what was the first subject that they really dealt with? Deer, bison, cattle. These guys were painting their food. Excuse me? So it was really kind of the first subject that artists dealt with was what they were going to eat. Here the hunters are hunting for their food. So it's really amazing that I don't think they were, painting deer and buffalo because they thought they were cute. They were painting them because they needed to eat, and these were what they were going to eat. Let's see what food images have captured the zeitgeist of the times and what they say about cultural shifts through the ages. So we're going to take a gourmand's stroll through art history. Next. Oh, those Romans. The festive consumption of food and drink was a very important social ritual to the Romans. This is a fresco from Herculaneum, and it shows a couple enjoying themselves Roman style. Okay. And yet, lavish banquets and seasonal rituals and celebrations that focused on their food and what they were going to eat, luxurious fare, luminous tableware, diverse forms of entertainment. Well, yes, sometimes a little over the top, but anyway, the Romans knew how to celebrate. Next. For our cookbook, John created, as I said, 106 original pastel artworks to enhance and illustrate the celebrations that we hosted and the food and drink that we provided for our guests. And this image is one of our favorite desserts. It's a French concoction called Coeur à la Crème, and it's shown served with a glass of Beaulieu Vineyards Black Muscat. Now, I think when it came to decadence, the Romans have nothing on us. Yeah. We can do that. Next. References to the relationship between culinary and artistic practices really document the interests of the great masters such as Leonardo da Vinci. It's said that when he was courting royalty and religious patrons at their castles and their affairs, da Vinci would dine on greens, fresh fruit, fish, vegetables, mushrooms, and pasta. He is said to have loved a soup that was made of chickpeas, and he called it la minestra. La minestra. And he was also apparently, from the notes that we have about him, an excellent cook and loved to entertain. So Da Vinci, was one of the artists who really took his food seriously. Next. As I mentioned, when I was a freshman at University of California, Davis, and John was a graduate student, I used to stay every day after class, after we started getting acquainted, and we would talk and talk and talk. And we've never shut up, actually. We just keep on talking about books and about another passion that we shared, classical music. And then we discovered that we also shared a passion for food and restaurants and cooking. I think we finally determined that that was probably in some way genetic because John's father, John Francis, was a chef and owned several restaurants and also a grocery store. And so he certainly was involved with food. And my grandmother had started her own catering business in an era in which women entrepreneurs were not usually, accepted. And my mother used to help her with her catering business and help with the cooking and help with the serving and so on and so forth. So my mother became very, very intrigued with food, and she lived in 17 different states in the Panama Canal Zone. And everywhere she went, she collected recipes. I think I mentioned to somebody she had a cookbook collection that had 450 cookbooks. And she used to read them like novels. I mean, she would, thumb through them and so on. And then she kept tons and tons of recipe files as well, things that she clipped or cut out or copied or something. And then everybody that she met, she was a school librarian, and she would grill all the teachers for their favorite recipes. And she tried everything. It was wonderful. She was just would take on any kind of cooking adventure. So when I came home for dinner, in the evening, I never knew if I was going to get black-eyed peas and cornbread or, tacos or teriyaki. She was just all over the place. International trials of all sorts. The first thing that I cooked was when I was 12 years old. I was taking French lessons from a lady down the street, Madame Marie. And she liked to talk about food also. So she and I got in these conversations about food. And I said, well, what's a really famous French dish that I might want to cook for my parents? And she said, well, boeuf bourguignon, French beef stew. And I said, okay. So the first main dish that I cooked was boeuf bourguignon and served it up to my parents, and they were properly appreciative. And I said, well, this is fun. We'll just keep doing this. So I was very interested when, for our first real date, John invited me over for dinner. I said, okay, this is interesting. And he mentioned that he and his father lived in a little house in Davis and that an actor friend was a roommate, David Morris. And so I didn't know quite what to expect. I mean, 3 bachelors. I mean, even though we talked about food, I was like, all right. But I went to John's house for dinner and he cooked me a fabulous crab louis. And he also had, he knew I loved everything Japanese, so he had gone to the trouble of bringing some sushi from Sacramento. David Morris, the roommate, had lived in Japan, so he knew what sushi restaurant to go to get the best sushi. So I had sushi and crab louis and wonderful wine. And okay, I said, I know a winner when I see one. So that was a start there. And this is John's rendition of his famous crab louis. Next. Few artists have painted portraits that are so bizarre as Giuseppe, is it Arcimboldo or Archimboldo? I always get the Italian wrong. One or the other. An Italian painter of the late Renaissance who made a name for himself in the courts of the Holy Roman Empire by creating painstakingly detailed portraits made out of vegetables and fruit. Okay, I don't know where he got that idea, but in place of the richly detailed facial features he that basically were part of the portrait tradition. He used these pieces of fruit and vegetables in both psychologically uh, interesting and scientifically accurate. His portraits were celebrated by his patrons. They got a real kick out of this. And it really sort of made a statement about what traditional portrait could be and what portraiture might be capable of doing. Next. John also managed to create beautiful portraits from humble subjects. Who would have thought that a plate full of sliced oranges could look quite so tempting? Next. In the 17th century, Dutch artists became famous for their still lifes of food and flowers. This is a painting by Clara Peters. She was a sort of first lady of Dutch painting at a time when women were not very well accepted into the ranks of artists. Very unusual for an artist in the 17th century. They were not taken seriously as artists. They really couldn't even get their names on the record as being artists, but she probably, they think, was the daughter of a painter. So he would have put her kind of in his book as being an acceptable artist. And this is one of the still lifes that she did. We know that she worked from about 1607, I think. Let me put my glasses on and make sure of that date. Yeah, 1607 to about 1621 is the time when she was most productive with her still life paintings, which she may have also studied with some of the other major still life painters at the time. And just kind of an amazing tour de force in terms of her handling both of the oil media and also of the still life subject. Next. What the same might be said of this pastel painting that John did of our table at our first dinner party after we had gotten married and moved to Santa Barbara. Now, we had rented a small, charming, brown shingled craftsman cottage on Prospect Avenue in Santa Barbara. It had leaded windows, it had glass cabinets, it had plank floors, and it had a window seat. And if I stood up on the window seat and looked through the branches of the avocado tree, I could see the ocean. So that was our view cottage. And the screen porch was covered with blossoming wisteria. Oh, it was so romantic. Well, what do you do when you're a 23-year-old faculty member with a 19-year-old wife? Well, of course, you invite the chair of the department over for dinner. What else would you do? And it wasn't just the chair of the department, it was Dr. Alfred Moyer, who was a Harvard graduate, quite the bon vivant. He knew all of the right people in Montecito and was doing great things for the department and for the college in terms of bringing in donations and collectors and so on. He had been in New Orleans for a lot of his career at Tulane University, and fabulous New Orleans. But we were undeterred and plied the good doctor with my boeuf bourguignon and some wines that he had never tasted because we were trying all kinds of different California wines. So we introduced him to a number of different things, and he seemed to have a roaring good evening. And we were very happy. Of course, we expected that he would, with the good food and the wine and so on. So when he finally went up the little brick path at about a little after midnight, everybody was in a very jovial mood. And we said, yes, okay, that went well. Well, the next morning at 8 o'clock, we were not ready to get up, but at 8 o'clock, we got a call from the director of the university gallery asking us over for dinner. So we guessed we'd passed our first test. But this is John's still life of the table at the Prospect Cottage with the boeuf bourguignon, and the leaded window in the background, and the kind of ambiance that the occasion had. Next. You're probably familiar with the work of Claude Monet. The National Gallery in Washington has more than 600 artworks that contain food, including this depiction of a luncheon party by Monet. He loved to entertain at his lovely house at Giverny. How many of you have been to Giverny? Oh, yeah. So you know what a beautiful place it is. And he was also an excellent chef, and he had a food journal that became the basis for his cookbook, Monet's Table. Anybody have the cookbook? Oh, it's really the one that inspired our cookbook because it was based on his food journals, just as our cookbook was based on the food journals that I had kept since about the time that John and I got together. So this is the luncheon from 1868, I think, yes. And it is a luncheon party with his first wife, Camille, at the table with their young son. It's an autobiographical painting that conveys Monet's appreciation of the finer things that make life so worthwhile. Next. Now, more controversial, really, was Monet's famous painting titled Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, the luncheon on the grass, in which two elegantly clad gentlemen are lounging on a blanket accompanied by two women, and one of them is naked. And the public was terribly shocked by this painting, not only by the fact that she didn't have any clothes on, but also she's sort of, staring out at the audience as though to say, so what, big deal. And this had she no shame? I mean, honestly. So next. In 1976, we had our own Déjeuner sur l'herbe with our friends Nate Shiner and Donna Hasbrook and our son Chris. We went for a picnic at Noonan's Lake, and here we are with our own version. We didn't do this on purpose, but after we looked at the photograph, we said, oh my God, I've seen that somewhere before, but I did have all my clothes on. Next. Our picnic included baked ham, John's wonderful 3-bean salad, and this luscious white cake with caramel frosting. Oh, yes. Next. The Potato Eaters. An oil painting by the Dutch artist Vincent van Gogh. It was done in April 1885. And The Potato Eaters is considered by many historians and critics to be Van Gogh's first great work of art. He had done a lot of, drawings and sketches and so on, but this was kind of the first major statement. And it's interesting to me that he focused on the simple life of the peasants and the workers that he encountered. And here he shows a family gathered around their humble meal of potatoes. And although the surroundings are far from luxurious, the mood is one of celebration and enjoyment. So it doesn't have to be that fancy. Next. Likewise, in his pastel of oven potatoes with rosemary, John makes a simple side dish look indeed delectable. Next, please. In the 1880s, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London opened the 3 restaurant rooms that were the world's first museum restaurants. And since then, food and cookery have been featured in museums in a number of different ways. In food, anthropology, science museums, those dedicated to key figures in the history of cookery. One of them is the Museum of Culinary Arts at the childhood home of Auguste Escoffier, who was the founder of haute cuisine and the father of modern cookery. Today, there's an ever-growing number of artistic spaces with extremely high-quality culinary offerings. This is the Bilbao Guggenheim Museum, and they had a groundbreaking project that's a prime example of this combination of food and art. It opened in 1997, excuse me, and to interpret the gastronomy as an expression of cultural identity and hospitality, a sign of quality and creative expression, and an intrinsic part of the museum's overall vision. Next. This is the interior, of course, with a bottle of good wine, another one of those finer things that John and I both treasure. We almost bought a winery at one point. Still wondering about that. Did we go the right direction, do you think? Oh, well. Next. From his autobiography, The Secret Life of Salvador Dali, the artist says that his first intention was to be a chef. That's what Salvador Dali wanted to do. Playing, composing, drawing pictures with words, all of these things can have multiple realities. It all depends on what lens you are looking through. And Salvador Dali's cookbook, Le Dîner de Gala, I'm sorry, is one of a number of cookbooks that have made their ways out of artists' studios and kitchens. It's just amazing how many cookbooks artists have put out. And I've got quite a collection of them. Picasso's Kitchen, Frida's Fiestas, Monet's, as I mentioned, cookbook. There are just a number of them that have come out of artists' infatuation with food and the way they draw a parallel between what's good to eat and what's good to paint. Next. I guess you could say that John took a few surrealistic liberties with his image of country-style green beans being watched over by a white rabbit. That's kind of curious, isn't it? Down the rabbit hole. Next. This is called Supper Time by Horace Pippin, done in 1943. And the body of Pippin's work developed, it goes beyond basic scenes of everyday life that typically come to mind when you consider folk art. And these are vehicles for interpreting important episodes in American history and grappling with what society may become. Giving Thanks and Supper Time hang in the Barnes Foundation along with post-impressionist paintings. And these, along with other European masters, convey the unique importance of the kitchen and taste in African American life and in the American imagination. So these spaces reflecting on your daily passing down of family history, recipes, traditions, discussing serious issues, observing daily religious rituals. But you can have a bite while you're doing all those things. Next. And speaking of rituals, my mom absolutely loved all things English. And so it's not too surprising that she loved English tea parties. We traveled, and we traveled quite a lot together, and we always were visiting places, I wonder why, like Vancouver or Ottawa, London, Bath, Cardiff, to name a few, where we could take advantage of the lovely tradition of taking tea. So for a special surprise party, I invited a dozen of Mom's Gainesville friends to take tea with us. Even though it was in December, it was warm enough to use the screen room in the deck of our house in Canopy that we loved. That's the Florida Advantage. Next. And John celebrated the tradition by creating this pastel of one of the tea time treats that we served, apricot balls, served very properly with my mother's treasured Spode china. Next. New cultural products express beliefs and values with the same power as food. And in art, food conveys a certain kind of ambiance, a certain approach to life and to food. Certain kinds of dishes and ingredients are connected with the elite, and then there's also the opposite, other kinds of food that are connected with more common people. And through this narrative and through still life, from old world classics to pop art, food sort of makes a comment on how the culture at the time views its food. Now, inspired by issues like rapid modernization, especially from the 1970s onward, artists like Andy Warhol responded to the changing landscape with the new contemporary idea about food, and pop art was born. Is his Campbell soup cans, a work of art that was produced in November 1961. And also he did a whole series that went through April 1962 and emphasizes the new taste for fast food, for conveniences, for the food industry, for the manifestation of new popular culture in terms of what sort of food would reflect that outlook. On the other hand, I don't think John and I gave it up as easily as some people. So we kind of kept with a more opulent idea about food, like John's chocolate cherry trifle, that conveys the sort of elite decadence that makes one's mouth water with envy. Next. This particular painting is not one of John's pastels, but rather an oil painting by Wayne Thiebaud, that artist that I mentioned, that was one of the first art teachers that I studied with at UC Davis, and whose graduate assistant was Mr. John O'Connor. It's often classified as pop art, but I think it would be more accurately to call American painter Wayne Thiebaud the godfather of the genre, since much of his work that could be considered pop art came before some of the other artists like Warhol and Rauschenberg and so on. Even in brief glimpses of Thiebaud's output, it makes you understand why he's often considered with artists like Jasper Johns or Robert Rauschenberg. And in fact, it was while spending time in New York and being exposed to work by those artists that Thiebaud began creating shape-based food displays, as he called them. He had received his art training at trade school. He was really, at first, he was an illustrator and a graphic artist. And that may explain the sort of practicality of his pieces. In the early 1960s, he released a series of colorful paintings of sweets, things like pies and cakes. And there was this 1964 painting, Lemon Meringue Pie. For Thiebaud, it was really a matter of paying tribute to something that he thought was really beautiful. And he thought food was beautiful. When I, as I mentioned, was first a freshman at UC Davis, Wayne had just begun this series of pies and cake paintings. And John and I were early enthusiasts. We thought these were beautiful and luscious. But Wayne's San Francisco gallery dealer, Marvin Hollis, was not at all convinced by this new work. So what on earth are you painting this stuff for? You should be painting landscapes or something. So one of Wayne's first shows of the pies and cakes was at the Artist Cooperative Gallery in Sacramento, and he had helped found that gallery. And John and I attended the reception to be supportive and also to see these works. And we tried to figure out how we could scrape together $200 to buy one of the paintings. Well, as it turned out, we should have sold the car or something, because these pie and cake paintings now go for around 8 million. Oh well. We should have grabbed them out of the garbage can, when Wayne did a sketch and tossed it away. Okay. John and Wayne were good friends, And we continued to see them after we were married. And Wayne and his second wife, Betty Jean, came to visit us in Santa Barbara a few months after we were married. And that's where we entertained them in the spring of 1963. And I heard from various sources that Wayne's favorite dessert was lemon meringue pie. So, both to tease him and please him, that's what I served to him, Betty. And this lemon meringue pie was painted the next year. Now, I can't say that he was inspired by my efforts, but he painted this not long after the visit, so I can say I must have had some small role in that. Which leads us to an explanation from John about how he went about creating the pastels that he did to enhance our book. Let me find the right group of things here. All right, and here we are. So let me introduce John to give you a little quick walkthrough in terms of his techniques.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the Matheson also for hosting us. Thank you, Caitlin. Mallory said that I had done 106 pastels for the book. And actually, I did about 110. I found 4 of them not really to my liking because they simply didn't have the right paper surface. And so it took a while before I found the type of paper that I really liked. But what I think is most interesting is that Mallory's been referring to these pastels as paintings, and I think most people don't think of pastels as paintings, but as drawings. But actually, because they're in color, they really are paintings. And in fact, pastel is the purest painting medium that we have. And the reason is that pastels in a pure form have no binder at all. In other words, it's simply the pure color itself. And in 2007, a manufacturer came on the scene that provided something very new in the way of pastels called pan pastels. And what pan pastels are is a particular medium that comes in little small plastic cups, and you can apply this material with a variety of different tools that they provide. And what you get essentially is a painting that is the brightest, most pure kind of color that you can. Now, having said that, it sounds as if what I do is spend an awful lot of time looking at something in front of me and painting it. And that's simply not true. The painting, the pastel that's next to the end over there on the easels, the one of the caprese, is the only pastel out of the 106 or 10 that was done from the actual photograph of that particular salad that I prepared. All of the other images are done with the computer. What I did essentially was to either from slides of mine, such as the one that Mallory mentioned about the cottage in Santa Barbara from 1964, that image in a transparency formed the point of departure for the rest of the image. But the rest of the images basically are stitched together like collages from multiple images sourced either from slides, photographs, or online from other sources, and all patched together. And then after Mallory and I have decided that we really feel that an image is appropriate for what we want out of the particular illustration for the book, we decide then to okay it, and I then print it out at 50% on an art paper that has a laid finish. And the laid finish, by the way, is not a pornographic term at all. It's has to do with a vellum-like surface that has lines etched into the paper to provide a simple amount of texture. So once it's printed at 50%, which this image shows, it's then done with pastel and subsequently fixed with a product called Spectrafix Degas Pastel fixative. And I mention this simply because if any of you have ever worked with pastel, pastel can be a very treacherous medium because it's a finely divided powder and you can inhale it and get it into your lungs. That's not a good thing to do. I usually wear one of these when I'm, in fact, working on pastels. But the thing about the Degas Spectrafix fixative that's interesting to me is that it's one of the only non-toxic fixatives you can buy. If you've ever used something like Krylon and you used it indoors, you're really taking a chance with lung cancer. The Spectrafix is made out of casein, which is a milk byproduct, and grain alcohol and water. And it's safe to use indoors. It doesn't come with a propellant in a can. It comes in a tube with a fixative, a spray fixative that you pump, and it's a safe alternative to using something that's toxic like the Krylon fixative. Have I missed anything, Mallory?
This is apple gingerbread upside down. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's have the next slide. Okay. Well, this is we've had quite a run in terms of our marriage, our culinary adventures, and certainly putting together this book, which, as I said, was done using my journals as a template for the idea of the book. And since 1962, I've kept this journal that I noted down all of the special occasions, whether it was a birthday or we were entertaining someone or an anniversary or whatever. And I kept the menu that we had. I kept the wine that we served, who was there, what we were celebrating. So I used that as the basis for our cookbook, and we picked out from the various places we've lived: Davis, Santa Barbara, Mexico, Ohio, Florida, Tennessee, just various places that our work and our lives took us, and then made the book kind of a little snapshot of where we had been, what we were doing, who we were working with, who we had met, who our friends were, and so on. So it does go beyond a traditional cookbook in terms of involving us and our adventures to a great degree, and seeing how the food reflects what we were doing, where we were, who we were with. So it's been a wonderful kind of keepsake for all of these wonderful times that we've had. I think last slide. We decided that we needed to have a sort of brand for us. And our son, who's around here somewhere, I'm not sure where, decided that he would make videotapes of us in the kitchen, because we work together in the kitchen most days, cooking breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And we have a rather small kitchen, so we tend to get in each other's way. And so Chris said, it's like two cats in the kitchen. And we sort of squabble over our territory, Get away from the refrigerator. Get away from the stove. How can I reach a knife if you're standing there? Will you back up? Anyway, so we're two cats in the kitchen, and we're going to have some fun with that. And I do have our in the other room where the food is. Where else would cats be? We have some of the cards that we did, the business cards that have our new logo of the two cats in the kitchen. So I invite you to go have a drink of wine, a taste of food, and please enjoy yourself. That's the whole point. Okay, that's